The sound that wakes you is not sudden, because it has been repeating all night at the appointed hours, and your body knows it before your mind can give it a name. The bell of the Abbey calls the brothers to matins, while the world outside the narrow window is still a deep, unbroken grey. You lie under a blanket of coarse wool that weighs on your limbs without warmth at first, the cold having crept into the cell through every seam of the stone. The ceiling above you is a darkness that gradually separates into the beams of oak, their edges sharpening as the bell continues to toll far down the cloister walk. You can hear it as a series of long, slow vibrations that travel through the floor and up the wooden frame of the bed, each stroke blending into the next without hurry. Your breath makes a small cloud in the air, and you watch it for a moment without thinking, because there is no need to think about anything yet. The bell stops, and a different sound takes its place. The thin, high murmur of the monks beginning the opening words of the office in the choir stalls, a sound that is more like the movement of air through a narrow channel than distinct voices. You push the blanket back, and the cold touches your hands and your neck, a clean cold that smells of old lime wash and the faint bracken of the mattress ticking. Your feet find the floor, which is a single slab of stone worn to a smooth hollow in the center, and you stand into the dim space that holds only a small wooden stool, a basin on a ledge, and the brown tunic hanging from a peg. The tunic is made of wool that has been spun and woven within these walls, undyed, the color of turned earth after a light rain. You pull it over your head and settle the weight of it across your shoulders, tying the cord loosely at the waist. The fabric carries the scent of dried lavender from the linen press, and underneath that the musk of many other mornings. You pour a little water from the earthenware jug into the basin, the sound of it trickling louder than you expect, and you splash your face and the back of your neck. The water is so cold it makes the skin tighten, and for a second you are entirely awake, though the wakefulness is quiet and does not disturb the deep calm of the hour. You dry your hands on a cloth that hangs beside the basin, and then you stand for a little while at the window opening, which is just a slit in the wall with no glass, looking out at the yard that separates your cell from the main cloister. The night is retreating so slowly that the change is not in the light itself, but in the way the shapes outside begin to lean away from the dark. A mist lies over the cobbles and the far wall of the chapter house, softening the line between stone and sky. You leave the cell and step into the passage that runs along the side of the lay brothers' quarters. Your shoes are soft leather, with no heel. The soles warm, thin and flexible, so your footfall makes only a whisper on the flagstones. The passage is dark except for the slight glow that seeps from the cloister end, a greyness that seems to gather around the archway. As you walk, you can feel the surface of the wall with the tips of your fingers, the stone rough and cold, the mortar between the blocks crumbling a little in places under your touch. The air in the passage is still and has the taste of old dust, a taste that reminds you without any particular memory of the long history of the place. You do not hurry because nothing in your day requires speed. The pace you keep is the same pace with which you do everything, a slow measured tread that matches the long hours of the garden. The passage opens into the cloister walk, and you pause just inside the archway, as you always do, letting your eyes adjust to the difference. The cloister is a covered arcade that forms a square round the garth, the open green space at the center that you will enter later. At this hour, the arcade is filled with a grey light that has no source, a light that seems to come from everywhere at once and settle in the hollow of each stone. The arches repeat along the walk in a row of identical curves, but the repetition is restful rather than rigid, a slow rhythm that the eye follows without tiring. The pillars are limestone, pitted and flaked by centuries of damp winters, and they hold the weight of the vaulted ceiling with a patience that makes the whole structure feel as natural as a grove of old trees. You begin to walk along the eastern side of the cloister, heading toward the door that leads to the garden, but you take the longest way around, tracing the full square before you go out into the garth, because the morning walk is part of the preparation. As you move along the walk, the first true light of the day begins to appear, not as a beam or a flash, but as a gradual thinning of the grey. You notice it first on the roof of the chapter house, that you can see through the open arches on your left, the tile shifting from a uniform dark to a pale dove color with a hint of pink at the ridge. The pink deepens slowly, each degree of change so small that you cannot catch it happening, and yet when you glance up again after counting 30 steps, the whole eastern sky beyond the roof is the color of a plum skin. The birds in the cherry tree at the center of the garth start to stir, and you hear the first tentative note of a blackbird, a liquid sound that runs down the scale and hangs in the cold air. The sound seems to belong entirely to this place and this hour, not intruding, but simply joining the quiet accumulation of small things that make up the morning. You pass the doorway to the warming house, and the faint heat from within touches your cheek like a memory of summer, gone before you can turn toward it. You pass the entrance to the scriptorium, where a single candle still burns, the flame steady because there is no draught. You pass the niche that holds a stone basin of holy water. The surface of the water so still that it holds the reflection of the arch above it with perfect clarity. Each of these things you notice without stopping, the way you might notice a familiar face in a crowd, because you have been walking this route at this hour for more years than you can easily count. The repetition does not wear a groove of boredom. It deepens a groove of peace. When you reach the western side of the cloister, you turn, and for a moment the length of the walk is laid out before you, a long straight perspective of arches and pillars that diminishes into the shadows at the far end. The light is now strong enough that the stone shows its true color, a warm cream with patches of darker gray where the damp has stained it. The floor of the walk is made of flagstones that have been laid in a pattern you know by heart, each stone a different shape fitted against its neighbors, without mortar. And over centuries the edges have become rounded, so that the pattern is as much about the shadows between the stones as the stones themselves. Your own shadow is now visible on the flagstones, a long stretched blue shape that moves ahead of you, and you see how the hem of your tunic swings with each step, a detail that you might have missed in the full dark. The bell of the chapter house begins its own small chime, a higher note than the great bell of matins, marking the moment when the community moves from prayer to the reading of the rule. You do not go to the chapter house because your work begins earlier and follows a different rhythm, but you listen to the chime as it fades, the last vibration lingering in the air for 3 full breaths. When it is gone, the silence that follows is not empty, but filled with the very small sounds of the Abbey, waking, a door closing somewhere in the kitchen wing, the scrape of a bench on stone, the gurgle of water in the drain that runs under the walk. All these sounds are so familiar that they become a kind of silence themselves, the background texture of a life lived within walls. You finally stop at the low wooden door set into the corner of the walk, the one that leads directly into the garth and the medicinal herb beds. The door is made of oak that has gone almost black with age, and it is crossed by iron bands that end in curled finials shaped like fern heads. You carry the key on a cord around your neck, and you lift it over your head, the metal warm from your skin, and fit it into the lock. The mechanism turns with a heavy clunk that you feel in your wrist rather than hear. The door swings inward without a sound because you oiled the hinges with lamb fat the week before, and you step out from the shadow of the arcade into the open air of the garden. The garth is a square of green, enclosed on all 4 sides by the cloister arches, a space that measures exactly 30 paces along each wall. The grass in the center is cut short, and it glitters with dew that has not yet been touched by the sun. Around the edges of the square, the raised beds arranged in a pattern that pleases the eye, long rectangles of dark soil edged with woven willow hurdles. The herbs stand in their drowsy rows, the grey-green of sage, the feathery tops of fennel, the broad leaves of comfrey drooping with moisture, the tight buds of lavender still closed. In the middle of the garth, the cherry tree rises from a circle of bare earth, its trunk gnarled and its branches beginning to show the first hint of leaf. The blackbird that you heard earlier is now visible on a low branch, its beak opening and closing as it pours out its song. You stand just outside the door for what might be a minute or might be much longer, your hands loose at your sides, your face turned toward the eastern sky where the sun is still below the roofline, but sending its color ahead in bands of rose and lemon. The air in the garth is colder than the air in the cloister walk because it is open to the sky and the night's chill still clings to the grass, but it is also fresher, carrying the scent of damp soil and the faint aniseed tang of angelica. You breathe in through your nose, slowly, filling the bottom of your lungs, and the cold air pricks at the inside of your chest in a way that is invigorating without being harsh. Your eyes travel over the beds, not checking in the sense of a duty, but simply looking, the way you might look at a page of a book you have read many times. You notice that the chamomile has put out new feathery leaves since yesterday, that the betony is leaning a little to the left because the soil has settled on that side, that a single weed has appeared near the edge of the mint bed, a small intruder that you will remove later with your fingers. None of these observations form into a list in your mind. They arrive as a single impression, a picture of the garden's condition that lodges in your memory without words. The garden is well, and the morning is calm, and the day ahead stretches out as a long, gentle slope of small tasks. The shadow of the chapter house roof moves another finger's width across the grass while you stand there, and you register the movement as a measure of time more reliable than any clock. The abbey around you has settled into its morning rhythm, the offices and the work and the reading proceeding in their appointed order. But here in the garth the only order is the order of growth, which follows a clock made of seasons and light and water. You are the intermediary between the garden's time and the abbey's time, the one who translates the slow language of roots into the daily round of human needs. The thought does not form in these words because you are not a man given to formulation. It resides instead as a deep, quiet satisfaction in the center of your chest, a feeling that everything is in its right place and you are in yours. Your thumb finds the iron key still in your other hand, and you slip the cord back over your head, tucking the key beneath the neck of the tunic, where it will lie against your breastbone for the rest of the day. The blackbird stops singing for a moment and cocks its head at you, its eye a bright bead, and then it resumes its song from a different branch, higher up where the morning light has just arrived. You take one step forward into the grass of the garth and the dew wets the leather of your shoe, a dark stain creeping upward, cold against your toes. The day has begun, and it's begun without any sound, louder than the blackbird and the distant closing of a door. The worn wooden door closes behind you, with the faintest click of the latch settling into its iron keep, and for a moment you are standing in a pocket of silence, between the cloister walk and the open garth. The wall of the arcade is at your back, throwing a long, cool shadow across the grass, but the rest of the garden already holds the first full daylight, a light that has no trace of grey left in it. The sky above the square of the garth has turned from plum to a pale blue that seems thin and new, the kind of blue that only comes after a night without clouds. You can see the top of the cherry tree catching the earliest direct sun on its highest twigs, which glow with a faint amber warmth while the lower branches remain in shadow, and the contrast makes the tree look like something lit from within. You walk forward slowly, the grass brushing the hem of your tunic and sending small cold drops of dew onto the wool, until you stand at the edge of the central square, where the ground rises into the first of the raised beds. The bed nearest to you is the one you have planted most recently with young comfrey, and you notice that the broad leaves have unrolled a little further during the night, their edges now softening from tight spirals into the beginning of flatness. The soil around them is dark and moist from yesterday's watering, and a single earthworm has surfaced in the channel between two plants, its body glistening as it moves without sound through the crumbled loam. You bend down, not because you need to act yet, but because the habit of your body is to draw close to the things that grow, and you rest your hands on your knees and look at the worm for a long moment as it works its way back under the surface. The iron key that hangs from the cord around your neck swings forward and taps gently against your tunic, and you straighten up and take it in your hand without thinking, the way a man might finger a talisman. The key has warmed to your body's heat, and its surface is smooth, the original sharp edges of the bow, worn round by decades of other hands before yours. You turn it over once, twice, feeling the weight of it, and then you tuck it back into place and walk on around the perimeter of the beds, your feet finding the narrow grass path that runs between the woven willow hurdles and the cloister wall. The blackbird that was singing earlier has moved to a lower branch of the cherry tree and fallen silent, busy now with the preening of its wing feathers. You can hear the quick flutter of its movements and the occasional small chirp it makes to itself, a sound that seems private and not meant for any listener. Beneath the tree, a circle of bare earth holds a scatter of fallen cherry stones from the previous autumn, already half buried in the soil, and you note without particular thought that the tree has seeded itself in the way it always does, generously and without fuss. The scent of the garden is more complex now that the light has touched it, the cold damp smell of night retreating and rising as a faint mist from the grass, replaced by the warmer fragrance of herbs breathing out their oils into the morning air. You pass the chamomile bed, and the scent becomes sweet and aptly, hanging around your head for 3 steps before it gives way to the sharper green smell of the fennel, which stands tall and feathery with drops of dew caught in the fine leaves like beads of glass. Beyond the fennel, the lavender is still tightly budded and holds its fragrance close. But when you brush your hand lightly across the top of the grey-green mound, the oils release onto your palm and you carry the smell with you as you continue your slow circuit. The cloister arches around you are beginning to echo with the small sounds of the Abbey's morning, the shuffle of leather-soled sandals on stone as a brother passes through the eastern walk, the distant clatter of a wooden pail being set down in the kitchen court, the voice of the novice's master reciting a line of psalm that drifts out from the chapter house and loses itself among the pillars. None of these sounds is loud enough to break the stillness of the garth. They arrive as gentle interruptions that fade almost as soon as they are heard, leaving no trace on the silence. You stop at the corner of the bed that holds the angelica, a plant that has grown taller than all the others and now stands at the height of your waist, its thick ribbed stems a pale green that blushes to purple at the joints. The leaves are large and divided into many pointed leaflets that curl slightly inward, and the whole plant has a presence that is architectural, like a small green tower. You touch the main stem with one finger, testing its firmness, and you find it sturdy and full of sap. The angelica is a plant that demands patience, waiting 2 full years before it flowers and sets seed, and you have been tending this particular clump for long enough that it has become a marker of seasons in your mind. A green calendar that you consult without words. The shadow of the pillar nearest the chapter house has moved a full finger's width across the grass since you first stepped into the garth, and you register the shift as you always do, the angle of the shadow giving you the hour more precisely than the bells. The pillar itself is a sturdy column of limestone, with a capital carved into a simple pattern of leaves, and the shadow it throws is crisp-edged and blue, stretching across the brightening grass until it touches the edge of the central square. You watch the shadow for a moment and see that its edge is not perfectly still, but quivers very slightly, a vibration caused by the movement of the air, or perhaps by the distant ringing of a bell, too low to hear. You walk back to the center of the garth and stand on the grass directly in front of the cherry tree, looking out over the whole arrangement of the beds. The garden is laid out in a cross pattern, with 2 main paths dividing the square into 4 quarters, and each quarter is subdivided into 3 long beds, separated by narrow grass walks. From where you stand you can see the entirety of your work, the symmetry of it, the way each bed holds its own population of herbs without one species crowding another. The order of the garden is not rigid. It is the kind of order that comes from years of small adjustments. A plant moved here because it wanted more shade. Another divided and spread along the row because it thrived, until the pattern is exactly suited to the light and the soil and the slow currents of air that move through the cloister arches. You think for a moment about the gardener who laid out these beds before you, a man whose name you never knew but whose habits you have learned from the garden itself. The depth of the topsoil, the angle of the drainage channels cut into the subsoil, the particular mix of sand and loam and rotted leaf mold that fills each bed. These are the signatures of a careful hand, a man who understood that a garden in a cloister is a garden that must last, that must produce its medicines year after year without depleting the ground. You have carried on his work without changing it, adding your own knowledge of the herbs and their needs, but the foundation remains his, and you feel a quiet gratitude toward him that you express only by continuing to do what he began. The blackbird flies down from the cherry tree and lands on the grass a few feet from where you stand, its head cocked, its bright eye fixed on the soil at the edge of the nearest bed. It hops twice and then jabs its beak into the ground, pulling out a small grub that you cannot see but that you know is there because the bird swallows and then wipes its beak on the grass. The bird is so accustomed to your presence that it does not fly away when you fold your arms across your chest and settle your weight onto one hip, a posture you take without thinking when you are observing the garden. You and bird have shared this space for many mornings, and the trust between you is simply the absence of threat, a mutual ignoring that is the deepest kind of animal peace. The light has now reached the base of the chapter house wall, and the stone is showing its full color, a warm ochre that seems to hold the sunlight in its pores. The roof tiles have lost their pinkness and become a uniform terracotta, and the weather vane on the apex of the eastern gable is catching the light so that it flickers as it turns in the faint breeze. You can feel the air beginning to move more noticeably, a light current that comes from the direction of the river and carries a coolness that is different from the coolness of the night, a freshness that belongs to running water and the open country beyond the Abbey walls. The breeze stirs the tops of the fennel and sets the angelica leaves nodding, and you feel it on your face as a gentle pressure that is almost a touch. You kneel down on the grass at the edge of the Bethany bed, the wool of your tunic soaking up a little dew from the blades, and you look closely at the plants. Bethany is a modest herb with small crinkled leaves and stems that will later send up spikes of purple flowers, but now in the early part of the season it is still a low rosette of green, hugging the soil. You run your fingers lightly over the leaves and feel the fine hairs that cover them, a texture that is soft and slightly rough at the same time, and you note that the plant has put out 3 new leaves since yesterday, each one a pale green at the center, darkening as it matures. The growth is steady and without any sign of stress, and you are satisfied. You stand up again and brush the loose grass from your knees, a gesture that you perform many times a day, and that has become so automatic you are not aware of doing it. The wool of your tunic is durable and does not show the dirt easily, but the habit of brushing away the debris of the garden is one that was taught to you long ago by the old gardener who came before you, and you keep it as a small act of discipline, a way of leaving the garden in the garden and not carrying it into the cloister walk. The garth is now fully lit, except for the narrow strip of shadow directly under the western arcade, and the colours of the herbs are bright and distinct. The mint leaves are a deep green that is almost black in its intensity. The sage is silver-grey with a bloom on its surface like the skin of a grape. The hyssop is a blue-green that seems to shift as the light moves across it. You walk slowly between the beds, touching a leaf here and there, lifting a stem that has leant too far over the willow edging, tucking a stray runner of strawberry back into its allotted space. Each of these small adjustments is made without hesitation, the kind of work that comes from knowing the garden so intimately that your hands find the right action before your mind has formed the intention. When you complete the full circuit, you find yourself back at the low wooden door through which you entered, and you stop and rest your hand on the iron latch. The door is weathered to a deep brown that is almost black in the grain lines, and the surface is smooth where countless hands have pushed it open. The iron bands that strengthen it are rusted to a dark orange in places, but the rust is stable and does not flake, held in place by the oil you apply each autumn. You look at the door and think about the generations of gardeners who have passed through it, each one carrying a key on a cord around his neck, each one stopping as you are stopping now to look back at the garth before going inside. The garden is ready for the day's work. The soil is moist, but not sodden. The weeds are few and small. The herbs are standing in their rows like a congregation at prayer. The blackbird has returned to its branch and resumed its song, a continuous outpouring of notes that seems to celebrate nothing in particular except the fact of the morning. The shadow of the chapter house pillar has moved another half finger's width, and the Abbey bell will soon ring for terce, marking the 3rd hour of the day. You have stood in this same spot at this same moment for so many mornings that the familiarity is not a dullness but a deepening, the way a path becomes more itself the more it is walked. You turn the latch and pull the door open, stepping back into the cloister walk where the air is cooler and dimmer, and you pull the door closed behind you without a sound. The key is still warm against your chest, and the scent of lavender is still on your palm, and you carry both of these things with you as you walk along the arcade toward the tool shed to begin the first proper task of the day, leaving the garth to the blackbird and to the slow turning of the earthworm and to the sunlight that is now warm enough to dry the dew from the tips of the grass. The cloister walk on the southern side is brighter than the others because it faces the open ground that slopes down toward the river, and the morning sun falls uninterrupted through the arches, laying a series of warm rectangles on the flankstones. You walk through them one after another, your shadow stretching and shortening as you pass from light to light again, the rhythm so steady that you notice it only as a flicker in the corner of your eye. The tool shed is set against the south wall near the corner where the arcade turns to run along the refectory wing, a small lean-to structure built of the same limestone as the cloister but roofed with wooden shingles that have weathered to a soft silver grey. Its door is a single plank of oak hung on leather hinges, and it stands ajar, as it always does, because you are the only one who uses these tools, and there is no need to lock what is already enclosed within the greater walls of the Abbey. You push the door open with your fingertips, and it swings inward on its own weight, the leather hinges giving a soft creak that sounds less like a complaint and more like a voice remembering its purpose. The inside of the shed is dim and cool and smells of dry earth, old wood, and the faint metallic tang of iron that has been oiled many times. The tools are kept in a precise order that you have maintained for so long that you could find each one in full dark. The spade and the fork standing upright against the back wall, with their handles nested in notches cut into a beam. The rake and the hoe hanging from wooden pegs on the side wall, with their teeth and blades turned inward, so that they catch no passing sleeve. The watering buckets stacked in a diminishing tower in the wooden trugs for carrying weeds lined up on a low shelf where the light from the single window falls across them. You take a moment, as you always do, to let your eyes adjust and to feel the presence of these companion objects that have shared your days. The spade is the first tool you reach for, and your hand closes around its handle at the exact balance point, a place where the wood has been worn smooth by your grip and darkened by the oils of your skin. The handle is made of ash, a pale golden wood that has taken on a deeper color at the point of contact, and the grain rises in fine parallel lines that you can feel as a slight texture under your thumb. The shaft runs straight and true down to the iron blade, which is a broad rectangle of metal slightly curved at the shoulders and sharpened along the bottom edge. The blade shows the mottled grey of iron that has been cared for, a patina of age and use without any rust, and the socket where the wood meets the metal is bound with a strip of leather that you renewed 2 winters ago. You lift the spade and rest it across your shoulder, the handle settling into the hollow above your collarbone, and you turn and step back out into the cloister walk. The door of the shed swings shut behind you with the same soft creak, and you walk along the arcade toward the low wooden door that opens into the garth, carrying the spade as a soldier might carry a standard, though without any sense of ceremony, simply because the tool is long, and this is the easiest way to transport it. The weight of the spade on your shoulder is a known weight, one that you have carried countless times, and it produces a gentle pressure that is almost comforting. As you walk, you can hear the small sounds of the blade tapping lightly against the back of your tunic with each step, a faint metal chime that is absorbed by the wool and lost in the larger quiet of the cloister. You pass through the low wooden door and into the garth, which now stands in full morning light, with the dew almost entirely gone from the grass, except in the strip of shade under the western arcade. The herbs are lifting their heads toward the sun, and the whole garden has a look of alertness, a sense of being fully awake. You cross the grass directly to the first bed on the eastern side, the one nearest the chapter house wall, which contains the young comfrey that you inspected earlier. This is the bed you will turn today, because the soil has settled and compacted over the winter months, and the roots need the loosening that will let them breathe deep and spread wide. The bed is a long rectangle bounded by willow hurdles woven in a herringbone pattern, and its soil is dark and slightly mounded toward the center, the surface dotted with the tiny green points of the comfrey shoots. You set the spade down beside the bed, laying it flat on the grass with its blade pointing away and its handle resting on the edge of the hurdle, and you take a moment to roll back the sleeves of your tunic to just above the elbow. The air is cool on your forearms, but not cold, the kind of coolness that feels clean and invigorating, and the hairs on your skin lift slightly in the breeze that comes across the garth from the direction of the river. You flex your hands once, twice, feeling the readiness in your knuckles, and then you lift the spade again and step onto the narrow grass path that runs between the bed and the cloister wall. You position yourself at the corner of the bed and plant your feet at the width of your shoulders, the left foot forward, the right foot back, settling into the stance that you will hold for the next hour. The first cut is always the same and always different, a reacquaintance with the particular soil of this particular morning. You place the blade of the spade at the edge of the bed, aligning it with the willow hurdle, and you press down with your right foot on the top of the blade's shoulder. The iron sinks into the soil with a sound that is half a slice and half a crunch, the blade parting the loose top layer and then meeting the firmer ground beneath. You push harder, and the blade slides down to half its length, the resistance steady and even, telling you that the soil is moist but not waterlogged, friable but not dry. You lean your weight onto the handle, and the blade sinks the rest of the way, the the top of the iron disappearing below the surface, and you feel through the wood the slight give of a severed root and the brief graze of a small stone that the blade pushes aside. You pull back on the handle, using the curve of the blade's shoulder as a lever against the soil, and the clod of earth begins to lift. There is a moment of resistance, a hesitation as the roots hold on, and then the soil breaks free with a soft sigh and rises up on the blade. You turn the spade over with a smooth motion of your wrists, and the clod falls upside down onto the grass beside the bed, landing with a dull thump that sends up a small puff of dust and the smell of fresh earth. You look at the upturned soil. It is dark and crumbly, shot through with the fine white threads of the comfrey roots that you have severed, and a worm is already working its way back into the depths, its pink body contracting and stretching in a silent rhythm. You step the spade back to the soil surface and make the second cut directly beside the first, the blade entering the ground with the same smooth pressure, and the rhythm of the work begins. The rhythm is not something you think about, it is something your body knows, a pattern stored in the muscles and the bones. Each cut is a sequence of 4 movements. Place the blade, press with the foot, pull back on the handle, turn and deposit the soil. The 4 movements flow into one another without pause, and the sequence itself flows into the next without a break, so that the whole work becomes a continuous motion like the turning of a wheel. Your breathing settles into a matching pace, slow and deep, your exhale coming on the lift, your inhale on the placement. The world around you narrows to the rectangle of the bed, and the feel of the spade, and the sight of the dark soil turning over onto itself, and everything else recedes into a gentle blur at the edges of your attention. The soil as it turns reveals its hidden life. Small white grubs curl and uncurl in the sudden light, then burrow back into the darkness. A centipede, disturbed, runs across the grass and disappears under a hurdle. The chopped ends of the comfrey roots glisten with pale sap, and the smell of the plant mixes with the smell of the earth to create a fragrance that is green and mineral at the same time. The soil itself changes color as you dig deeper. The top layer, a dark brown that shades into a lighter reddish brown where the clay begins, and you can see the boundary between the two as a wavy line in the side of the trench you are creating. The deeper soil is cooler and heavier, and it clings to the blade in a way the topsoil does not, requiring a little extra flick of the wrist to release it. You work along the length of the bed, advancing by the width of the spade, with each cut, the trench growing behind you and the pile of upturned clods building on the grass. The willow hurdles press against your shins as you lean forward, their weave rough through the wool of your hose, and you adjust your position without stopping, shifting an inch to the left, then an inch back again. The sun climbs higher and the shadows shorten, and you feel its warmth beginning to settle on the back of your neck and on your shoulders, a warmth that is still pleasant because the air remains cool. A bead of sweat forms at your hairline and runs slowly down your temple, and you wipe it away with the back of your hand without breaking the rhythm, a gesture that is part of the work as much as the cutting and lifting. Above the cloister arches, the sky has filled with small clouds that have come in from the west, thin white puffs that move slowly across the blue, and you notice them when you pause for a moment to straighten your back. You rest the spade upright with its blade in the soil, and you lean on the handle, your forearms crossed over the top, and you look up at the clouds. They are the kind of clouds that bring no rain, high and light and scattered, and they cast no shadow on the ground. One of them has a shape like a fish, another like a leaf, and while you watch, the fish slowly looses its tail and becomes a shapeless patch of white. The clouds remind you that the world outside the Abbey walls is large and full of movement, but the reminder is distant and does not disturb the peace of the enclosure. You return to the work, lifting the spade from the soil and stepping forward to the next uncut section. The wooden handle has warmed from your hands and now feels almost like a living thing, the ash smooth and dry against your palms. The same spot where your right hand grips the shaft has become slightly darker with moisture, and you shift your grip a little higher to give the wood time to dry. The blade of the spade is now coated with a thin film of soil that sticks to the iron in patches, and the edge has lost its initial sharpness, dulled by the fine abrasion of the earth. You make a mental note to sharpen it later, a note that will surface at the end of the day when you return the tools to the shed. As you work deeper into the bed, the character of the soil changes subtly. Near the center you encounter a patch where the comfrey roots are thicker and more intertwined, a mat of white fibers that holds the soil together in a dense clump. The spade meets this patch with more resistance, and you have to use your full weight to push through it, the blade sinking slowly as the roots part one by one. When you lift the clod, it comes up as a single heavy mass, and you knock it against the side of the spade to break it apart, the roots tearing with a moist sound and the soil crumbling away to reveal the pale inner structure. The work here is slower, more deliberate, and you adjust your pace accordingly, allowing the rhythm to stretch out to accommodate the extra effort. The bell of the chapter house announces the office obterse, its note carrying clearly through the still air, and you pause in your work long enough to hear the brothers begin their procession into the choir. The sound of their singing reaches you as a distant murmur threaded with the occasional clear note that escapes through an open door, and you listen without stopping your hands, the Gregorian chant weaving itself into the fabric of the morning like a golden thread. The words are Latin, and you know them by heart, though you do not sing along because your voice is in your hands and in the turning of the soil. By the time the singing ends, you have reached the halfway point of the bed, and you stop to assess what you have done. The trench you have created is a long dark wound in the earth, but it is a wound that will heal and bring new growth, a necessary opening. The upturned clods on the grass are steaming faintly in the sun, their moisture rising as a thin vapor that you can see only when you look at an angle. The soil looks richer now, its structure broken up and aerated, ready to receive the water and the air that the roots need. The comfrey plants that you have displaced lie to one side, with their roots wrapped in a damp cloth, waiting to be replanted, and they will be none the worse for the temporary disturbance. You begin the second half of the bed with the same steady rhythm, working now from the center toward the far end. The sun has moved enough that the shadow of the chapter house pillar has shifted onto the grass beside the bed, a cool stripe of blue that you work alongside, your own shadow overlapping it. The breeze has died down, and the garth is very still. The only movement the occasional stir of a leaf or the bobbing of a chamomile head as an insect lands and takes off again. The blackbird has disappeared and the garden is quiet, except for the sound of your spade, the soft crackle of breaking roots, and the thump of the soil falling onto itself. When you reach the end of the bed, you make the final cut, lifting the last clod and turning it over with a care that is almost tender. You step back and look down the length of the freshly turned soil, which now lies in a long even mound of dark crumbled earth, its surface irregular and broken, but its overall shape neat and contained within the willow hurdles. The smell of the turned bed is strong and clean, the smell of fertility and potential, and you breathe it in deeply, letting it fill your chest. The work has left a pleasant tiredness in your arms and a warmth in your muscles that is the reward for steady effort. You take the spade to the grass and lay it down flat, then kneel beside the bed and use your hands to pull out any remaining weed roots that the blade has missed, your fingers moving gently through the loose soil. There are not many, just a few pale threads of bindweed and the small bulbous roots of buttercup, and you collect them in a little pile on the hurdle. The soil feels good under your fingers, crumbly and cool, and you press a handful of it together and watch it fall apart again, satisfied with its condition. The sun is now high enough that the warmth is general, and the last of the morning coolness has gone. You stand and brush your hands against your tunic, then pick up the spade and rest it on your shoulder once more. The first bed is turned and the work of the morning has been good, and you walk back along the grass path toward the tool shed, leaving the bed to settle in the sun, while the clouds drift silently overhead and the Abbey bell waits quietly in its tower for the next appointed hour. The spade is back in its notch against the beam, the blade wiped clean with a handful of dry grass that you plucked from the edge of the path, and now you stand in the tool shed with the cool air settling around you after the warmth of the garth. The next tool you need is the watering bucket, and you turn to the corner where 3 of them are stacked in a diminishing tower, each one nested inside the next. You lift the top bucket free with both hands, the oak staves smooth and dry under your fingers, the iron bands are dark grey against the pale wood. The bucket is not large, holding perhaps 2 gallons when full, but it is sturdy and well made, the staves fitted so tightly that no light shows between them. You test the rope handle, which is made of hemp twisted into a cord as thick as your little finger, and you find it sound, the fibers still springy and without any fraying. The bucket has a particular smell, a clean, woody scent with a hint of the water that has soaked into its pores over years of use. And you carry it in front of you with both hands on the rope as you leave the shed and walk along the cloister toward the cistern. The cistern is set into the corner where the eastern arcade meets the northern one, a place that catches the runoff from the chapter house roof and channels it down through a stone spout into a deep underground tank. The tank is covered by a circular stone lid with an opening in the center just wide enough for the bucket to pass through, and the lid is worn smooth around the rim where generations of ropes have rubbed against it. Above the cistern, the cloister ceiling is open to the sky, a deliberate gap left in the vaulting so that the rain can fall directly in, and the flagstones around the base are slightly dished from centuries of dripping water. The air here is cooler than elsewhere in the cloister and carries a smell of wet stone and the faint mineral freshness of the water that lies waiting in the dark below. You set the bucket down on the flagstones beside the cistern, and it makes a hollow wooden sound, a talk that echoes briefly between the close stone walls. The rope for drawing water is coiled on a wooden peg set into the wall, a long length of the same hemp cord that you use for tying bundles of herbs, but thicker and older, darkened by water and time to a deep brown that is almost black in the creases. You lift the coil from the peg, and it is heavy and cool in your hands, the fibers stiff at first, and then loosening as you work the coil free. The rope has a particular way of being handled, a sequence of loops that must be undone in the right order or it will tangle, and your hands perform this task without any instruction from your conscious mind, freeing the end and tying it to the handle of the bucket with a knot that you have tied so many times it is more a reflex than a skill. You lower the bucket through the opening in the stone lid, paying out the rope hand over hand with a steady motion that sends a gentle vibration up through the fibers. The bucket descends into darkness and you listen for the sound it will make when it meets the water, a sound that you know by heart, but that is always slightly different depending on the level of the tank. The cistern is deep and the bucket falls for a long moment, the rope sliding through your palms with a soft hiss, and then you hear the small hollow plosh as the wooden bottom breaks the surface. The sound travels up through the opening and reaches you as a low musical note that seems to hang in the still air of the corner. You let the bucket fill, feeling its weight increase through the rope as the water pours in through the gaps between the staves. The rope grows heavier in your hands and you adjust your grip, taking the strain with your shoulders rather than your wrists, leaning back slightly in a pose that your body knows as well as standing or walking. When you judge that the bucket is full, you begin to pull it up, the rope moving through your hands in the opposite direction now, wet and slightly cold, the water squeezing out of the fibers and running down your wrists in thin trickles that disappear under the rolled sleeves of your tunic. The bucket rises through the darkness and appears in the opening with a glint of reflected sky on its surface, the water trembling and sending small rings out toward the staves. You lift the bucket clear of the opening and set it on the flagstones, the water sloshing gently against the sides and spilling a few drops onto the stone where they bead up and sit like tiny lenses. You look down into the bucket and see your own face reflected in the dark circle, the features wavering and indistinct, the colors of your tunic and the stone wall behind you blended into a single image that shimmers as the water settles. The surface steadies, and for a moment you see yourself clearly, an ordinary face but deep lines around the eyes and the mouth, the face of a man who has spent many years looking at small things closely. Then you untie the rope from the handle, coil it back onto the peg with the same automatic care, and lift the bucket by its rope handle, feeling the full weight of it now pulling against your arm. The walk from the cistern back to the garth is a short one, but you take it slowly because the bucket is heavy and the water is precious, and there is no reason to spill it through haste. The water moves inside the bucket with a gentle rhythmic slosh that matches your steps, and you can feel its momentum shifting at each turn, a living weight that you must accommodate with small adjustments of your wrist and shoulder. The light from the cloister arches falls across the surface of the water and breaks into shifting patterns, and you watch these patterns as you walk. The way the light bends and scatters, the way the reflection of the pillars trembles and reforms. You reach the low wooden door and manage it with one hand while the other holds the bucket steady, a maneuver you have performed hundreds of times, and you step through into the garth. The garden is quiet under the climbing sun, the turned bed waiting for you with its dark soil exposed and thirsty. The comfrey plants that you lifted are still lying on the grass with their roots wrapped in the damp cloth, and you note with satisfaction that the cloth is still moist and the leaves have not begun to wilt. You cross the grass directly to the bed and set the bucket down on the edge of the hurdle, the water sloshing one more time and then stilling. The first watering of a freshly turned bed is a task that requires a particular kind of attention, a different rhythm from the digging, but one that belongs to the same family of movements. You kneel beside the bed and cup your right hand, dipping it into the bucket, and coming up with a small pool of water that leaks between your fingers even as you lift it. You hold your hand over the soil and let the water fall in a broken sheet, the drops striking the dark earth and making small craters that collapse as quickly as they form. The sound of the water hitting the soil is a soft patter without any splash, more a whisper than a sound, and it ceases as quickly as it began when your hand empties. You repeat this action, dipping and pouring, moving your hand across the surface of the bed in a slow sweep that covers every inch of the turned soil. The water that falls from your fingers catches the light and makes a brief arc of brightness before it vanishes into the dark earth, and you watch the color change as the moisture penetrates, the dry brown surface deepening to a rich near black that spreads outward from each drop like a slow stain. The soil drinks the water greedily at first, pulling it down into the channels and air pockets that the spade has opened, and then more slowly, as the ground becomes saturated, the water beginning to pool in the low spots, and then seeping away. You dip your hand into the bucket again and again, the water growing shallower with each pass, and you adjust the angle of your paw to reach the far corner of the bed, leaning out over the hurdle with one hand braced on the woven willow. The water in the bucket is now cloudy, with the soil that has washed back from your hands, a pale brown tint that deepens as you work, and the smell of wet earth rises from the bed in a thick, clean steam. The scent fills the air around you and mingles with the other garden smells, the chamomile and the fennel and the faint sweetness of the mint, until the whole garth seems to be breathing out a single compounded fragrance of growth and moisture. When the bucket is empty, you sit back on your heels and look at the bed with the same close attention that you gave it before you began. The soil is now evenly moist, its color uniform and dark, and the surface has settled slightly under the weight of the water, so that the bed is a little lower and a little denser than it was. The comfrey roots that remained in the soil will feel this moisture seeping down to them, and they will begin to send out new fine white hairs into the loosened earth, anchoring themselves for the season ahead. You run your fingers lightly over the surface and feel the coolness of the wet soil, the way it clings to your skin in a thin, dark layer, and you are satisfied. You stand up and take the bucket back to the cistern for a second drawing, because one bucket is never enough for a full bed, especially one that has been turned and opened to the air. The second trip is a repetition of the first, the coiling and uncoiling of the rope, the descent of the bucket into the dark, the hollow plosh, and the heavier climb back to the light. This time the water is colder, drawn from deeper in the tank where the sun never reaches, and when you dip your hand into the bucket for the first pour, the chill makes the bones of your fingers ache for a moment before they adjust. The second watering is gentler than the first because the soil is already damp and receptive, and the water spreads horizontally rather than sinking straight down, wetting the surface evenly with a glossy sheen that reflects the sky. You water the bed a third time, a lighter pass, just enough to settle the last dry patches near the edges where the soil meets the hurdles, and then you set the empty bucket on the grass and look at your work. The bed is ready for the comfrey plants to be returned to it, but that task belongs to the later part of the morning, and for now, the moisture must have time to seep deep into the subsoil, where the roots will follow it. You pick up the bucket and walk it back to the cistern for one final drawing, this time to water the other beds that have not been turned but still need their morning drink. The routine of watering the established beds is a quieter version of the same work, a slow progression around the garth with the bucket and the cupped hand stopping at each herb in turn. The sage receives its share first, the water running off the silver-grey leaves and dripping down to the soil in a scattered pattern, the leaves themselves shedding the moisture as though it were a light rain that they were designed to repel. The chamomile drinks more eagerly, its feathery foliage catching the drops and holding them until they slide down the stems. The mint spreads wide, and its leaves overlap one another so that the water must be poured carefully into the center of the clump where the stems rise bare. The hyssop and the betony and the angelica each receive their portion, and you adjust the amount according to the needs of each plant, giving more to the thirsty angelica and less to the lavender which prefers its feet dry. By the time you have completed the circuit, the bucket has been filled and emptied many times, though you have not kept count, and your hands are chilled and reddened from the cold water and the air. The watering has taken much of the morning, not because it is heavy work, but because it is slow work that cannot be hurried, each pour requiring its own moment of attention. The sun is now well above the roof of the chapter house, and the shadows have shrunk to small dark pools at the base of the pillars, the kind of shadows that offer little shade. The garth is warm and the watered soil is steaming gently in the sun, the vapor rising in thin wisps that vanish as quickly as they appear. You return the bucket to the tool shed and hang it upside down on its peg so that it will dry without warping, the last drops of water falling to the flagstone floor in a slow rhythm. Tock, 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 and then stopping. The shed is dim and quiet, and the tools are all in their places, and you stand for a moment in the doorway looking back across the cloister walk toward the garth, where the beds are dark with moisture, and the herbs are lifting their leaves to the light. The morning has been good, and the work has been steady, and you feel the deep quiet satisfaction of tasks completed without hurry, the soil turned, the water drawn and poured, the plants given what they need to begin another day of slow, invisible growth. The low stone bench at the edge of the bed has been there longer than anyone remembers, a single slab of limestone set on two squat legs that are half buried in the grass, and its surface is worn to a gentle hollow where countless sittings have polished the stone to a smoothness that feels almost like wood. You lower yourself onto it, feeling the cool of the stone through the wool of your tunic, and you allow your back to rest against the pillar of the arcade behind you. The pillar is warm on one side, where the sun has been striking it, and cool on the other, where the shadow has lain, and you settle into the place where the two temperatures meet. Your hands are still damp from the watering, and they leave faint dark prints on the stone as you adjust your position, prints that will fade in a few breaths as the moisture evaporates in the warming air. The linen pouches are kept in a small wooden chest that sits at the end of the bench, a chest made of oak with iron hinges and a simple clasp that you open with a flick of your thumb. The lid rises with a faint creak, and the smell that comes out is dry and papery, the smell of seeds and dried herbs and the lavender that you tuck into the corners to keep away the moths. Inside the chest, the pouches are arranged in a row, each one a small bag of unbleached linen tied with a length of hemp twine, and each one has a different shape depending on the seeds it contains. Some are plump and rounded, others are flat and soft, and one is almost empty and lies limp against the bottom of the chest. You know which is which by their feel and their position, having placed them in this order after the last sowing, and having returned them to the same places ever since. You lift the first pouch and hold it in your palm, feeling its weight, the way the seeds inside shift against one another with a soft rustle that you can hear if you hold it close to your ear. The linen is soft from handling, the fibers loosened and slightly fuzzy, and the twine around the neck has been tied and untied so many times that it has formed a permanent curl. You work the knot loose with your thumbnail, a slow process because the twine is dry and stiff, and you do not want to break it, and when the pouch opens, the smell of the seeds rises to meet you. These are the fennel seeds, and their fragrance is sharp and sweet and slightly spicy, a smell that seems to open the passages of your nose and fill your whole head with a clean green warmth. You tip a few seeds into your palm and look at them. They are small, elongated ovals with ridges running lengthwise, a pale greenish-brown in color, each one no larger than a grain of wheat, but lighter, and they roll across the lines of your palm as you tilt your hand. The fennel bed is the one at the far end of the eastern quarter, a narrow rectangle that you prepared 2 days ago by turning the soil and working in a little sand to improve the drainage, because fennel likes its roots to be dry even when the rest of the garden is moist. You stand up from the bench and carry the pouch to this bed, the seeds still cupped in your other hand, and you kneel down on the grass path beside it. The soil is light and crumbly and has dried to a pale brown on the surface, and you take the small pointed stick that you keep tucked under the edge of the hurdle, a stick of hazelwood that has been sharpened at one end and worn smooth by use. With this stick, you draw a shallow drill along the length of the bed, a groove no deeper than the first joint of your little finger, the hazel point parting the soil with a soft scratching sound that is almost musical in its regularity. When the drill is complete, you take the seeds between your thumb and forefinger, a pinch at a time, and you drop them into the groove at measured intervals, each seed falling alone and settling into its place with a tiny tap that you feel more than hear. The spacing is not measured with any tool but with the judgment of your eye and the habit of your hand, a distance of about 2 finger widths between each seed. Because fennel grows tall and needs room to spread its feathery leaves, the seeds lie in the bottom of the drill like a string of small pale beads, and when the row is complete, you set the stick aside and use the flat of your hand to brush the soil back over the groove, covering the seeds with a thin layer of fine earth that you pat down gently with your fingertips. The patting is firm enough to make contact between the seed and the soil, but light enough not to compact the earth, a pressure that you have learned over many seasons and that you apply without thinking. You mark the end of the row with a small twig pushed into the soil, a reminder of what has been sown there, and then you return to the bench and take up the second pouch. This one is heavier and makes a deeper rustle, and when you open it, the seeds that pour into your palm are larger and rounder, a dark brown that is almost black with a pale seam around the edge. These are the angelica seeds, and they have a smell that is entirely different from the fennel, earthy and slightly bitter, with a hint of the tall green plant they will become. Angelica seeds are particular in their needs, requiring a period of cold before they will germinate, and you have kept them in the coolest part of the tool shed through the winter, bringing them out only now when the soil is still cool enough to fool them into thinking that winter has passed and spring has arrived. The angelica bed is in the shadiest corner of the garth, the place where the northern and western arcades meet and where the sun only reaches for a few hours in the afternoon. The soil here is richer and heavier than in the fennel bed, with more leaf mold worked into it, and it holds the moisture longer, so that when you kneel beside it, the dampness seeps through the wool of your hose. You make the drill with the same hazel stick, but this time you press a little deeper, because angelica seeds are larger and need to be buried further down where the temperature is more stable. The stick sinks into the soil with a soft resistance, and the drill that it leaves behind is a dark line in the brown earth, straight and even. You drop the angelica seeds one by one into the drill, spacing them a little wider than the fennel, because these plants will grow tall and broad, with leaves that spread wide and stems as thick as your thumb. The seeds look like small dark pebbles against the soil, and each one makes a faint indent as it settles. When all the seeds are in their places, you cover them with soil, but this time you press down a little more firmly, because angelica needs a close contact with the earth to trigger its slow awakening. Your palm leaves a series of faint impressions in the soil, and you smooth them out with a final sweep of your hand. The third pouch is the comfrey, a plant that you are replenishing in the bed you turned this morning. The comfrey seeds are not seeds at all in the usual sense, but small dark nutlets with a hard shell, and they feel in your palm like tiny pebbles worn smooth by a stream. They have no noticeable smell, or rather, their smell is so faint that it is not a smell at all, but a texture in the air, a dryness that you can detect only by contrast with the living scent of the garden around you. Comfrey is a generous plant that will grow almost anywhere, but it does best in soil that has been deeply dug, and so the bed you prepared earlier is ideal. You carry the pouch to the turned bed and kneel on the grass that is still flattened from your earlier work, the soil dark and moist and ready. The comfrey seeds are planted not in a straight drill, but in small clusters of 3, spaced at wider intervals along the bed, because the plant spreads by its roots as much as by its seeds, and each cluster will eventually form a single large clump. You make the holes with your finger rather than with the stick, pressing into the soft soil with your index finger up to the second knuckle, and then dropping 3 seeds into each hole before pinching the soil closed over them. The soil is cool and damp around your finger, and it clings to your skin in a thin layer that you wipe off on the grass after each hole. The rhythm of this planting is different from the others, a series of punctuated actions rather than a continuous line, and your body adjusts to it without breaking the overall calm of the task. The last pouch is the lightest, and when you open it, the seeds that fall into your palm are so small and fine that they look like dust, a pale brown powder that moves with your breath. These are the betony seeds, and they are the most delicate of all the herbs you grow, requiring a light touch and a careful eye. The betony bed is a small square near the center of the garth, close to the cherry tree, where it gets dappled shade for part of the day, and the soil has been prepared to a fine tilth, the surface raked smooth so that it is as flat as a table. You do not make a drill for the betony seeds because they are too small and would be buried too deep. Instead, you scatter them over the surface of the soil with a gentle motion of your hand, the seeds falling like a fine rain and settling into the tiny crevices between the soil particles. Then you take a handful of dry, sieved soil from a small pile you have kept to one side, and you sift it over the seeds through your fingers, a dusting so thin that it barely covers them, just enough to anchor them against the wind and to keep the light from drying them out. You sit back on your heels when the sowing is done, and your lips have been moving silently through the whole task, forming words that you do not speak aloud. The prayers that your old teacher taught you to say over the seeds as they go into the ground. The prayers are not long or formal, but simple words of hope for the rain and the sun and the patience of the earth, and you say them without attention because they have become as much a part of the planting as the motion of your hand. The garden around you is quiet, and the seeds are in the soil, and the sun is moving slowly across the sky in its own appointed rhythm. You gather the empty pouches and fold them carefully, tucking each one back into the wooden chest, and you close the lid and slide the clasp into place. The twigs that mark the rows stand like small sentinels, and you look at them with the same quiet satisfaction that you feel at the end of any planting, a feeling that is not excitement, but a deep, steady peace, the knowledge that the work has been done well and that the seeds will do their own work now in the darkness under the soil. You brush the loose earth from your hands and rise from the bench, your knees stiff from kneeling, and you stand for a moment looking out over the beds that hold the new sown and the established herbs together, the whole garden, a single continuous life that you are a small part of. Time in the garden is measured not only by the bells and the shadows, but also by the small, slow changes that happen at the surface of the soil, the appearance of a new leaf, the leaning of a stem toward the light, and the quiet arrival of the weeds. The weeds come without announcement and without malice, their seeds carried on the wind or dropped by birds or already waiting in the soil from seasons past, and they begin their growth in the same way the herbs do, with a tiny pale root and a pair of seed leaves that push up through the dark earth. The difference is only in the intention, the fact that these plants have chosen a place that was meant for others, and so they must be lifted and removed before they take the water and the nourishment that belong to the fennel, the angelica, the comfrey, and the betony. You have known for several days that the weeding time was approaching, because you have seen the first fine green haze appearing on the surface of the beds, a colour that is not the colour of the herbs you have sown. This morning, when you step into the garth after the office of Tercy, the haze has resolved itself into distinct shapes, small rosettes and pointed leaves and thread-like stems that have appeared between the rows and along the edges of the hurdles. The weeds are still young, their roots shallow and easily broken, and this is the moment to remove them before they can establish themselves and send their fibers deep into the soil, where they will compete with the herbs for the deep moisture and the slow minerals. You go to the tool shed and take the wooden weeding board from its place against the wall, a simple rectangle of beechwood that is slightly longer than the width of your body and polished smooth on both sides by years of use. The board is padded on one side with a thick layer of straw that is held in place by a piece of sacking tacked around the edges, and this padding will protect your knees from the hard ground during the long stretches of kneeling that the weeding requires. You also take the small hand fork from the shelf, a tool with a short ash handle and 3 curved tines that have been sharpened at the tips, and you carry both items across the cloister walk and through the low wooden door into the garden. The morning is mild and still, the kind of morning that seems to hold its breath, and the light is soft and even under a high covering of thin cloud that has spread across the sky since dawn. The cloud diffuses the sunlight so that there are no sharp shadows, only a gentle illumination that makes every leaf and stem stand out clearly without any glare. This light is good for weeding because it lets you see the difference between the herbs and the intruders without the confusion of bright highlights. And you set the board down on the grass path beside the fennel bed with a sense of quiet readiness. You lower yourself onto the board, your knees finding the padded surface and your weight settling forward onto your hands, and then you shift your position to face the bed, arranging your tunic so that it does not bunch under your knees. The board distributes your weight across the grass and keeps you from sinking into the soft soil, and the straw padding muffles the pressure of the wood so that you can kneel for long periods without discomfort. The hand fork is in your right hand and your left hand is free for the delicate work of grasping and pulling, and you begin your slow progress along the edge of the bed. The first weed is a chickweed, a small low plant with tiny pointed leaves arranged in opposite pairs and a thin stem that is almost translucent. Chickweed spreads quickly, sending out runners that root at every node, and a single plant can become a mat in a matter of weeks if it is not removed. You slide the tines of the fork under the root, loosening the soil with a gentle wiggling motion, and then you take the weed between your thumb and forefinger and pull it free. The root comes up intact, a fine white thread with small branching hairs, and the soil falls away from it as you lift. You tap the root against the side of the hurdle to shake off the remaining earth and then place the weed on the stone path behind you where it will lie with the others in a slowly growing pile. The second weed is a shepherd's purse, a little more advanced than the chickweed, with a rosette of lobed leaves that spread flat against the soil and a central stem that is just beginning to rise. The shepherd's purse has a deeper root than the chickweed, a small taproot that goes straight down and requires a little more care to extract without breaking. You work the fork in at an angle, prying the soil upward until you see the pale root appear, and then you grasp the plant at the base and pull with a steady, even pressure. The root slides out of the soil with a slight sucking sound, and you add the weed to the pile on the path. The weeding continues in this way, a slow progression along the length of the bed, each weed identified and removed with the same careful motion. The work is repetitious but not monotonous, because each weed is slightly different and requires a slightly different touch. The chickweed comes up easily with a light pull. The shepherd's purse needs the fork. The small grasses that have seeded themselves from the central lawn have a fibrous root system that clings to the soil and must be teased apart with the tines. Your hands learn the feel of each weed as you work, the cool moisture of the chickweed, the rough texture of the shepherd's purse leaves, the wiry resistance of the grass roots, and you adjust your grip and your pressure accordingly. The smell of the weeding is green and sharp, the bruised leaves releasing their sap into the air in small invisible puffs that you catch as you lean close to the soil. The chickweed has a clean vegetal scent that is almost like lettuce. The shepherd's purse has a faint peppery smell, and the grasses smell simply of cut grass, the most ordinary and familiar of all garden smells. The fragrances mingle together and are carried off by the light breeze that has begun to move through the cloister arches, replaced by new greenness with each weed you pull. The pile on the stone path grows steadily, the weeds already beginning to wilt as their roots lose contact with the soil. You glance at them occasionally as you work, not to measure your progress but simply to note the accumulation, the tangle of green stems and leaves that are now separated from the living garden. Later you will gather them up and carry them to the composting corner behind the tool shed, where they will break down into a dark, crumbly matter that will one day be returned to the beds as nourishment for the herbs they once competed with. The office of Terse has long since ended, and the sounds of the Abbey have settled into the quiet pattern of the mid-morning work period. Somewhere beyond the cloister walls a brother is sawing wood, the slow rasp and pause of the saw repeating in a steady rhythm that matches the rhythm of your weeding. A door opens and closes in the refectory wing, and you hear the distant clink of pottery being moved. These sounds reach you as gentle reminders of the life that continues around you, but they do not interrupt your focus, which remains entirely on the small patch of soil before you and the fine distinctions between wanted and unwanted growth. The fennel seedlings have emerged since the sowing, and you work around them with extra care, your fingers moving delicately through the soil so as not to disturb their fragile roots. The seedlings are tiny versions of the adult plant, each one a miniature spray of feathery leaves that are a pale bright green, a color that seems to glow in the soft light of the overcast morning. They stand in their row like small green flames, and you weed the spaces between them with a particular tenderness, knowing that these young plants are the future medicine of the Abbey, and that every weed you remove gives them a little more room to stretch and grow. When you reach the end of the fennel bed, you sit back on your heels and stretch your back, your spine making a soft series of small clicks that you feel rather than hear. Your hands are coated with a thin layer of soil that has worked into the creases of your knuckles and under your nails, and you rub them together to loosen the dirt before wiping them on the grass. The pile of weeds behind you on the path is now a substantial mound, and the fennel bed looks cleaner and more orderly, the soil bare and dark between the neat rows of seedlings. You feel a quiet satisfaction that is not pride, but simply the recognition of work done. The same feeling you have at the end of any task that has required patience and care. You lift the weeding board and move it along the path to the comfrey bed, where the weeds have also taken advantage of the moist turned soil to establish themselves. The comfrey bed has a different character of weed growth, more chickweed and fewer grasses, and the soil is softer so the roots come up more easily. You settle back onto the board and resume the work, your hands falling into the familiar pattern of fork and pull, fork and pull. The comfrey plants themselves are thriving, their large leaves unfurling fully now and their stems thickening, and you work around them with the same careful attention you gave to the fennel. The morning wears on, and the light shifts subtly as the thin cloud cover begins to break up, letting through the first direct rays of the sun. The shadows reappear, faint at first and then sharper, and the temperature rises a little so that you feel the warmth on the back of your neck and on your hands. A bee arrives in the garden, a heavy golden body that moves slowly from flower to flower, and you hear its drone as it investigates the chamomile and then moves on to the sage. The sound is deep and contented, and it seems to vibrate in the air for a long moment after the bee has passed. The weeding of the angelica bed takes longer than the others because the angelica is still small and looks very much like some of the weeds that grow beside it, and you must pause often to examine a plant closely before deciding whether to pull it or leave it. You compare the shape of the leaves, the color of the stem, the way the plant stands, and you make your decisions with the same slow deliberation that you apply to everything in the garden, never rushing, never guessing. When you are unsure, you leave the plant in place and move on, knowing that it will declare itself more clearly in a few days, and you can return to it then. The Bethany bed is the last one, and by the time you reach it the sun is well past the midpoint of the morning and the shadows are shortening toward noon. The Bethany seedlings are still tiny, just a sprinkle of green dots across the dark soil, and the weeding here is the most painstaking of all, because the weeds are almost the same size as the herbs and the distinction between them is very fine. You work on your elbows rather than on the board, your face close to the soil, your breath stirring the tiny leaves as you lift each weed with the point of the fork. The work is absorbing in its smallness, your attention narrowed to a circle of soil no wider than your two hands. When the last weed is pulled and added to the pile, you rise slowly to your feet, your knees stiff and your back complaining with a dull ache that is the honest result of long kneeling. You pick up the weeding board and the fork and you carry them to the stone path, where the pile of pulled weeds is now large enough that you will need to make 2 trips to the composting corner. The garden looks different after the weeding, calmer and more orderly, the herbs standing in their clean rows with space around them to breathe and to grow. The soil is smooth and dark, and the small green leaves of the seedlings are bright against it. And you stand for a moment looking at the garden with the same quiet attention that you give to everything within these walls. Then you bend down and gather the first armful of weeds. Their wilted leaves cool and damp against your sleeves, and you carry them along the path toward the corner behind the tool shed, where they will return to the earth in their own slow time. The sun climbs to the middle of the sky, and the light in the garth changes from the soft grey-white of the overcast morning to a hard bright gold that pours down through the open square and fills every corner with heat. The cloud cover that diffused the early light has dissolved entirely, melting away into the pale blue that arches over the Abbey, and the sun now beats directly on the leaves of the herbs and on the flagstones of the Cloister walk, and on the dark-turned soil of the Cloister walk and on the dark-turned soil of the beds that you have weeded and watered through the morning hours. The heat is not oppressive, but it is thorough, a steady weight that presses down on your shoulders and makes the air feel thick and slow. The shadows under the arcade have shrunk to narrow strips of deep blue that barely reach the edge of the grass, and the blackbird has retreated to the coolest part of the cherry tree where the leaves cluster thickest and the sun cannot penetrate. You stand in the center of the garth for a moment, the sun hot on the crown of your head and on the back of your neck, and you feel the sweat that has gathered along your hairline and at the small of your back under the wool of your tunic. The weeding is finished, and the pile of pulled plants has been carried to the composting corner, and the watering bucket hangs drying on its peg in the shed, and the seeds have been pressed into their drills and covered over, and there is nothing that needs your immediate attention. The garden knows how to wait through the middle of the day, And you have learned over many summers that the best thing you can do for the herbs during the hours when the sun stands overhead is to leave them alone, to let them close the pores of their leaves and slow their breathing, and simply endure the light in their own silent way. You walk slowly toward the northern arcade, where the shadow is deepest and where the stone of the pillars holds the coolness of the night long after the rest of the cloister has warmed. The grass under your feet is dry now. The last of the dew long since evaporated, and it brushes against your ankles with a papery rustle. The scent of the garden has intensified with the heat, the oils in the leaves warming and releasing their fragrance into the still air, so that every breath you take carries a different note. The sweet apple of the chamomile, the sharp green of the fennel, the earthy depth of the comfrey, the clean medicinal tang of the sage. The smells layer over one another like the voices in a choir, each one distinct but blending into a single harmony that hangs over the garth as palpably as the heat. You reach the arcade and step up from the grass onto the flagstones, the change under your feet from soft to hard registering as a faint click of your heel on the stone. The shade closes over you like a cool cloth laid across your forehead, and you pause just inside the shadow to let your eyes adjust to the dimness. The arcade on this side of the cloister is the quietest part of the whole abbey at midday, because the sun does not reach into it, and the brothers who might cross from the chapter house to the refectory use the eastern walk instead, where the arches are open to the light and the breeze. Here, on the northern side, there is only the still shade and the rows of empty flagstones and the pillars standing in their silent procession. You choose the pillar that stands second from the corner, the one that has a slight hollow worn into the flagstone at its base, where generations of the gardener before you have sat in this same way on hot afternoons. The pillar is a broad column of the same limestone that makes up the rest of the cloister, and its surface is pitted and flaked in places. But the side that faces the inner walk is smooth from the brush of many shoulders and the leaning of many backs. You lower yourself onto the flagstone with your spine against the pillar, drawing your knees up slightly and resting your forearms on them, and you let out a long, slow exhale that you did not know you were holding. The stone is cool through the wool of your tunic, a deep coolness that seems to come from the very center of the earth, and you feel the heat of the morning beginning to leave your body, rising off your skin like steam from a damp cloth. From where you sit you can see the whole of the garth laid out before you, the rectangle of green grass and the darker rectangles of the herb beds, the cherry tree standing in its circle of bare earth, with the blackbird invisible among its leaves. The light in the garden is so bright that it makes the colors seem to vibrate, the green of the mint and the silver of the sage and the purple green of the angelica stems, all shimmering slightly in the heat. Above the garth, the sky is a deep blue that shades to paler blue at the edges where the heat haze blurs the line of the rooftops. And there are no clouds at all now, nothing but the sun and the blue and the small dark shape of a swallow that has come in from the river and is circling high overhead, its movements quick and angular against the stillness of the garden. You watch the swallow for a while, the way it sweeps and turns and catches insects that you cannot see from where you sit, and then your gaze drops back to the herb beds and you begin to look at them in the way you look at things when there is no work to be done, a slow, idle looking that has no purpose except the looking itself. The chamomile is in full flower now, a low carpet of feathery green studded with small white daisies that have yellow centers, and the heat has made the flowers open wide so that they look like tiny upturned faces drinking the light. The scent of the chamomile rises in the warmth and reaches you even here in the shadow, a sweet, heavy fragrance that makes your eyelids feel thicker and your breathing slow. The sage stands beside the chamomile, a bush of grey-green leaves that are soft and woolly to the touch, and the heat has brought out the silvery bloom on the surface of the leaves so that the whole plant seems to be coated in a fine dust that shimmers when the faint breeze stirs. The sage leaves are shaped like long ovals with a pebbled texture, and they overlap one another in a dense arrangement that shades the soil beneath and keeps the roots cool. A single bee is working its way across the sage, landing on each small purple flower and then moving on to the next. And you can hear the drone of its wings from where you sit, a low, steady hum that blends with the other small sounds of the afternoon. The fennel has grown taller in the week since you sowed the seeds, and the new seedlings are now small feathery tufts that rise from the dark soil in their neat rows, but the older fennel plants at the far end of the bed are already waist-high and beginning to form their flower heads, flat umbels of tiny yellow blossoms that catch the light and hold it. The fennel leaves are so fine that they look like green smoke against the darker green of the comfrey behind them. And when the breeze moves through the garden, the fennel sways and bends in a way that is different from the other herbs, more fluid, more graceful, as though the plant were made of water rather than of stem and leaf. The comfrey has recovered from its transplanting, and the leaves are now large and broad and a deep, rich green, the color of the forest floor in high summer. The leaves are rough to the touch, covered in tiny hairs that catch the light and make them look slightly frosted, and they spread out from the central crown in a generous circle that covers the soil and keeps the weeds from returning. The comfrey is a plant that gives the impression of deep contentment, and looking at it from across the garden, you feel a corresponding contentment in yourself. A sense that the plant is exactly where it wants to be, and you are exactly where you want to be, and nothing is required of either of you in this hot, still hour. The angelica towers over the other herbs in its shady corner, its thick ribbed stems rising to the height of your shoulder, and its large divided leaves spreading out like green hands. The angelica has a presence that is almost architectural, a vertical emphasis that draws the eye upward, and in the midday light the stems glow with a pale green luminosity that seems to come from within. The plant has not yet flowered. It is waiting for its second year for that, but the buds are forming deep in the crown where the stems join, and you know that when the time comes the flower head will be a great globe of tiny white blossoms that will attract the bees from all over the Abbey grounds. The lavender at the edge of the southern bed is still tightly budded, its grey-green mounds neat and compact, and the heat has not yet coaxed the flowers to open, but the buds are swelling and the colour is beginning to show, a pale purple that darkens a little each day. When you brush against the lavender in the evening, the oil comes away on your fingers and the scent lingers for hours. But now in the heat, the scent is faint because the plant is keeping its oils close, protecting them from the evaporating sun. The lavender is a plant that knows how to wait, and you respect its patience. You shift your position against the pillar, settling your shoulder blades more comfortably into the curve of the stone, and you let your eyes move slowly across the garden without stopping anywhere in particular, the way you might let your gaze drift across a familiar page of scripture without reading the words. The heat has stilled everything, the birds and the bees and the very air itself, and the only movement in the garth is the slow turning of the swallow high above, and the even slower drift of the shadow of the chapter house roof as it creeps across the grass. The shadow has reached the edge of the central square now, and is beginning to touch the rim of the cherry tree's circle, and you note this without any sense of urgency, simply as a fact of the afternoon, a measure of the hour that confirms what your body already knows. Your eyelids have grown heavy, not with sleep, but with the kind of deep rest that comes when the body has worked well through the morning and has earned its stillness. You do not close your eyes entirely, but you let them half close, the garden becoming a blur of green and silver and gold seen through your lashes, and you breathe slowly and evenly, drawing the warm, herb-scented air deep into your lungs and letting it out again without any effort. The drone of the bee on the sage has become a continuous hum that seems to come from the air itself rather than from any single insect, and the distant sounds of the abbey, the closing of a door, the murmur of a voice, the faint ringing of a small bell marking the approach of sext, all reach you as though from a great distance, softened and made gentle by the heat and the shade. You let your mind settle on nothing in particular, drifting across the surface of the garden like the shadow of a cloud that is not there. The geometry of the beds arranged in their cross pattern pleases you in a way that is deeper than thought. The order of the rectangles and the straight lines of the paths and the circle of the tree at the center, forming a pattern that the eye can rest on without tiring. The herbs stand in their rows like words in a sentence, each one meaning something different, but all of them together saying something about patience and growth and the slow turning of the year. A small brown butterfly enters the garth and flutters across the grass, its movement erratic and light, and you watch it as it visits the chamomile, and then the sage, and then continues on its way through the arches toward the river. The butterfly is the only thing in the garden that seems to be in a hurry, and even its hurry is gentle, a flickering dance that leaves no disturbance behind it. When it is gone, the stillness returns, deeper than before. The heat of the day will last for another hour or two, and then the sun will begin to slant toward the west, and the shadows will lengthen, and the coolness will return from the river, and you will rise from your place against the pillar and go back to the beds to begin the afternoon tasks of cutting and bundling and tidying. But for now there is no task and no need, only the shade and the scent of the herbs and the slow breathing of the garden in the quiet center of the day. You let your head rest back against the pillar, and you close your eyes fully, just for a moment, and the darkness behind your eyelids is warm and comfortable, and filled with the lingering after-image of the green and silver leaves, and the gold light and the blue sky. The heat of midday has passed from the garth, retreating slowly as the sun begins its long descent toward the western hills beyond the river, and the light has changed from the hard bright gold of noon to a softer amber that slants across the cloister arches and falls in long warm rectangles on the grass. The shadows have stretched out again, reaching across the flagstones and the beds, and the air has lost its thick stillness and begun to move once more with the cool breath that comes up from the water meadows in the late afternoon. You feel the change on your skin as you rise from your place against the pillar, the sweat on your brow drying in the light breeze, and you stand for a moment in the arcade, letting your body adjust to the transition from rest to movement. The garden has weathered the heat well. The herbs have passed through the hottest hours, with their leaves slightly drooped, a natural wilting that is not distress, but a wise conservation of moisture. And now as the temperature eases, they are lifting their heads again, the chamomile flowers turning their yellow centers back toward the sun, the fennel unbending its feathery tops, the sage leaves plumping as the sap moves more freely through the stems. The soil in the beds has dried to a pale brown on the surface, but is still dark and moist, a finger's depth down, and the watering you did in the morning has held well. The garden is ready for the next task, which is the cutting and the bundling of those herbs that are at their peak of leaf and fragrance. You walk around the garth to the tool shed, your steps slower than they were in the morning, your body still carrying the pleasant heaviness of the midday rest. The shed is dim as always, and the tools are in their places, and you reach for the curved harvesting knife that hangs from a small wooden peg near the door. The knife has a blade of iron shaped like a crescent moon, sharp along the inner curve and blunt along the back, and the handle is a short piece of ash, worn to a dark smoothness by the grip of your hand and the hands before yours. The blade glints faintly in the light that comes through the small window, and you test the edge with your thumb, finding it keen and clean. You also take a length of hemp twine from the coil that sits on the shelf, enough to tie many bundles, and you loop it over your arm where it rests with a light roughness against the wool of your sleeve. Then you take a large square of linen cloth from the stack on the lower shelf, a cloth that you use only for carrying the cut herbs, and you fold it over your other arm and walk back out into the slanting afternoon light. The first plant that calls for cutting is the angelica, which stands tall in its shady corner with its leaves fully expanded and its stems thick with sap. Angelica is best harvested in its first year before the flower stalk has formed, while the sweetness is still concentrated in the leaves and the upper part of the root, and you've been watching this particular clump for several days, waiting for the moment when the leaves are at their largest but still tender. The moment has arrived, and you kneel beside the plant on the grass path, spreading the linen cloth on the ground beside you to receive the cut stems. The angelica leaves are broad and divided, each one the size of a dinner plate, and when you take hold of a stem, the plant resists slightly, its roots holding firm in the cool soil. You slick the curved blade around the base of the stem where it meets the crown and make a single clean cut, drawing the knife toward you with a smooth motion that severs the fibers without tearing them. The cut surface is pale green and glistens with sap that smells sweet and slightly musky, a fragrance that rises to your nose and seems to coat the back of your throat. You lay the cut stem gently on the cloth, its leaves spreading out like a green fan, and then you cut another and another until you have taken 5 good stems from the plant and left the central crown intact so that it can send up new growth in the weeks to come. The mint is the next plant ready for cutting, a sprawling bed of dark green that has spread almost to the edges of its allotted rectangle and is sending up tall flowering shoots with small pale purple blossoms clustered around the stems. The mint smells of coolness even in the afternoon warmth, a sharp, clean menthol fragrance that seems to clear the head and open the breathing passages, and you kneel beside it and breathe in deeply before you begin to cut. The mint stems are square in cross-section, a characteristic of the plant, and they snap cleanly under the knife with a small, crisp sound. You select the tallest stems, the ones that are beginning to flower but have not yet set seed, and you cut them low on the plant where the leaves are largest and fullest. The cut stems release their fragrance in a wave that surrounds you, and the scent is so strong that it seems to tingle on your skin and on the inside of your nose, a sensation that is both sharp and pleasant. You lay the mint stems alongside the angelica on the cloth, their dark leaves contrasting with the paler green of the angelica, and the mingled scents of the two plants create a new fragrance that is sweet and sharp together. The sage is ready too, its grey-green leaves plump and pebbled and covered in the silvery bloom that gives the plant its soft appearance. Sage is a plant that benefits from regular cutting, the new growth coming back bushier and fuller after each harvest, and you have been cutting this same clump for several years now, so that it has formed a dense rounded shape like a small grey cushion. You select the outermost stems, the ones that are beginning to lean outward and would soon touch the ground, and you cut them with the same clean slicing motion, the knife passing through the woody stems with a slight resistance that tells you the plant is healthy and well hydrated. The smell of sage is warm and savory, a fragrance that reminds you of the kitchen on feast days when the cooks stuff the geese with sage and onion, and it mingles with the mint and the angelica to add a deeper note to the green bouquet that is building on the cloth. The chamomile has been flowering for a week now, and the small white daisies are at their peak, the yellow centers full of pollen and the petals spread wide to the afternoon light. Chamomile flowers are the part you harvest, not the feathery leaves, and you set the knife aside and use your fingers instead, pinching each flower head just below the base where the small green bract holds it to the stem. The flowers come away with a gentle pop, and you drop them one by one into a small linen bag that you have taken from the chest, a bag that will keep the petals from scattering. The work of picking the chamomile is slow and painstaking, your fingers moving from flower to flower in a rhythm that is almost like the telling of beads, and the scent of the crushed blossoms is sweet and appley and soothing, a smell that has been used for centuries to calm the restless and bring sleep to the sleepless. The sound of the flowers dropping into the bag is a soft pattering, and the bag grows fuller, and the scent grows stronger as you work your way across the bed. When the chamomile is picked and the bag is tied with a slip of twine, you turn to the last of the herbs that are ready for cutting, which is the hyssop growing in a neat row along the southern edge of the garden. Hyssop is a small shrubby plant with narrow leaves arranged in pairs along woody stems, and its flowers are spikes of deep blue that the bees love above all other flowers in the garden. You cut the hyssop stems low on the plant, selecting the ones that have the most flowers and the healthiest leaves, and you add them to the growing pile on the linen cloth. The hyssop has a pungent medicinal smell, clean and sharp and slightly bitter, and it has been used in the infirmary for chest complaints and for cleansing wounds, a powerful herb that must be used with care and knowledge. The cloth is now piled high with the cut herbs, the stems lying in a loose sheaf that is a patchwork of different greens and different fragrances, and you take a moment to sort through them with your fingers, removing any damaged leaves or stray bits of grass that have clung to the stems. The herbs are fresh and crisp and they rustle softly as you handle them, a papery sound that is the sound of plants giving up their moisture to the air. You have taken only what the garden can spare, leaving enough on each plant for it to continue growing and thriving, and the beds look tidier for the cutting, the remaining stems standing straight with more space around them, the light reaching deeper into the crowns. Now the bundling begins. You take the length of hemp twine from your arm and cut a piece of it with the harvesting knife, a piece about the length of your arm from wrist to shoulder. You gather the angelica stems into a loose sheaf, their thick ribbed stalks lying parallel, and you wrap the twine around them twice near the base and tie a simple knot that will tighten as the stems dry and shrink. The twine is rough against your fingers but pliable, and it holds the bundle firmly without bruising the stems. You tie a second bundle of angelica and set both of them to one side on the cloth. The mint is bundled next, the stems coming together easily because they are square and they align without rolling against one another. The mint bundles are smaller than the angelica bundles because the leaves are more delicate and need more air around them to dry without mouldering, and you tie them with a lighter touch, the twine snug but not tight. The scent of the mint rises afresh with the handling, and your fingers are coated with the menthol oils, so that when you lift your hand to your face, you smell only coolness and nothing else. The sage bundles are the easiest to tie because the stems are woody and hold their shape well, and you make 3 bundles of sage, each one the thickness of your wrist, the grey-green leaves spreading out at the top in a fan. The twine crinkles against the woody stems, and the knot pulls tight and holds, and you set the sage bundles alongside the others in a neat row. The hyssop is bundled in smaller sheaves because the stems are thinner and the leaves are small, and you tie each bundle with a longer piece of twine that leaves a loop at the end for hanging. The hyssop will be dried upside down in the drying room, so that the essential oils flow down from the stems into the leaves, concentrating the medicinal properties, and the loops you have tied will slip over the hooks that wait in the rafters. When all the herbs are bundled, you look at the row of sheaves lying on the linen cloth, each one tied and neat, their green heads aligned, and their cut ends showing the pale inner circles of the stems. The bundles are arranged in order of size, the tall angelica at one end, the short hyssop at the other, and the mint and sage and the bag of chamomile flowers in between. The fragrances have combined into a single complex sweetness that hangs in the still air around you, and you breathe it in with the same deep, slow breath that you take at the end of any task, a breath of completion and satisfaction. You gather the corners of the linen cloth and bring them together, making a loose sack of the bundles, and you lift the whole package carefully, cradling it against your chest with both arms. The weight is not great, but it is substantial, the weight of the morning's growth and the afternoon's labor together, and you carry it along the grass path toward the low wooden door that leads back into the cloister walk. The sun has moved further toward the west, and the shadows of the pillars stretch across the whole width of the garth now, and the light on the chapter house roof is a deep gold that will soon turn to orange. The garden behind you stands in the quiet of the late afternoon, the cup plants already beginning to seal their wounds and turn their attention to new growth, the soil dark and moist beneath the surface. The blackbird returned to its branch, and watching you go with its bright bead eye. You push the door open with your shoulder and step through into the dim, cool arcade, carrying the harvest inward toward the drawing room, where the bundles will hang in the darkness and slowly give up their moisture to the air, becoming medicine for the months ahead. The birch broom stands in its corner of the tool shed behind the door, a bundle of thin twigs bound tightly around a handle of smoothed hazelwood, and you lift it out with one hand, feeling the familiar lightness of it, the way the twigs rustle against each other with a dry, papery sound. This broom has been used for many seasons, and the twigs have worn down at the tips to a soft bevel that makes them gentle on the gravel paths, and the hazel handle has taken on a dark polish from the grip of your palm. You also take the wooden rake from its peg on the wall, a tool with a head made of beech and teeth carved from the same block, and you carry both implements out into the late afternoon light that is now pouring through the cloister arches in long golden bars. The garth has changed its character since you left it with the bundled herbs. The shadows have stretched all the way across the grass to the eastern arcade, and the light has warmed from amber to a deep honey color that seems to coat every leaf and every stone with a thin layer of gold. The herbs stand in their neat rows, the ones you have cut now showing the pale circles of their severed stems, the ones you have left whole, lifted toward the sinking sun. The air is cooler than it was at midday, but still warm enough that you do not need the sleeves of your tunic rolled down, and the breeze from the river has settled into a gentle, steady current that moves through the cloister arches in a slow circular flow. You begin the tidying at the far end of the garden, where the fennel bed meets the northern arcade, setting the broom and the rake down on the grass, while you first attend to the small things that need your hands. A tendril of bindweed has crept up through the willow hurdle and wound itself around the stem of a young fennel plant, its pale white flower just beginning to open, and you unwind it carefully with your fingers, tracing its length back to the soil and pulling it free with a single firm tug that brings the root up intact. The fennel straightens gratefully, now that the weight is gone, and you pat the soil around its base to steady it. A fallen leaf from the cherry tree lies across the chamomile bed, and you lift it away, its surface dry and brown and curling at the edges. A small stone has worked its way up through the soil in the comfrey bed, and you pick it out and toss it onto the grass where it will not interfere with the roots. These small adjustments are as much a part of the day as the larger tasks, and you make them without counting them, moving from one to the next in a slow wandering path that covers the whole garden. The rosemary bush at the corner of the southern bed has leant too far over the grass path, its woody stem bending under the weight of its narrow aromatic leaves, and you fetch a short stake from the pile behind the tool shed and push it into the soil beside the bush. Then you take a length of twine and tie the stem gently back toward the stake, not pulling it tight, but simply encouraging it, giving it a support that will guide it upward again as it grows. The rosemary releases its sharp, clean fragrance as you handle it, and the scent clings to your fingers and to the twine and to the stake, a smell that is like the memory of a warm hillside in a southern country far from these damp northern walls. When the small adjustments are done, you take up the birch broom and begin the raking of the paths. The paths that run between the beds are made of fine gravel that has been trodden down over the months into a hard surface, and the morning's work of digging and weeding and watering has left its marks on them, small scuffs and scattered crumbs of soil and the indentations of your own knees and feet. You start at the outer edge where the grass meets the cloister arcade, and you draw the broom towards you in long, slow strokes, the birch twigs making a sound that is half a scratch and half a sigh as they pass over the stones. The gravel moves under the broom, the larger pieces turning over and settling into new positions, the smaller grains sifting down between them, and the stray bits of soil and leaf are gathered into a small wave that you push ahead of you as you work your way along the path. The sound of the broom is a steady rhythm that blends with the other sounds of the late afternoon, the distant lowing of cattle from the Abbey meadows beyond the river, and the cooing of a wood pigeon in the cherry tree, and the faint ringing of a bell from the direction of the infirmary. Your body falls into the rhythm of the raking, as it fell into the rhythm of the digging and the weeding, a pace that is slow and even, and that allows your mind to drift across the surface of the garden like the shadow of the swallow that has returned to circle overhead. You smooth the marks of your own passage from the paths, erasing the evidence of the morning's labor, leaving behind a surface that is clean and even and ready for the next day. The path along the eastern side of the garden takes the most work, because this is where you walked many times with the watering bucket and where you knelt on the weeding board through the long morning, and the gravel here is disturbed in a wide pattern of overlapping impressions. You work the broom across it in a series of parallel strokes, the birch twigs leaving faint lines in the gravel that look like the ripples on a sandy shore at low tide, and gradually the pattern of your footprints disappears and the surface becomes uniform again. The light is beginning to take on the deeper color that comes just before the sun dips below the roofline, and the shadows of the pillars have stretched so far that they now reach the opposite wall of the arcade, slender fingers of blue that lie across the flagstones like fallen columns. When the paths are raked and smooth, you stand the broom against the cloister wall and take up the wooden rake. The rake is for the grass of the central square, which has grown long enough in the past weeks that it needs a light combing to lift the flattened blades and to remove the few fallen leaves and twigs that have collected at its edges. You walk around the cherry tree with the rake, drawing it through the grass in gentle strokes that lift the green blades and make them stand upright again, and the grass takes on a fresher look, the color brightening where the rake has passed. The cherry tree stands above you, with its leaves rustling softly in the breeze, and you see that the small green fruits are beginning to swell, each one a hard little sphere that will ripen slowly through the summer and be ready for picking in the weeks after the feast of St. John. The garden is now tidied and ordered, the paths smooth and the grass combed and the herbs standing in their neat arrangement with their cut stems sealed and their remaining leaves lifted to the light. The shadows have reached the far wall of the garth, and the first touch of pink is appearing in the sky above the western arcade, a color so faint that it is more a suggestion than a presence. You stand for a moment at the edge of the central grass, looking out over your work, the broom in one hand and the rake in the other, and you feel the deep quiet that comes at the end of a day that has been filled with small good tasks. The garden is ready to be left for the night, and you are ready to leave it. You carry the broom and the rake back to the tool shed and return them to their places, the broom standing upright in its corner and the rake hanging on its peg with its teeth turned to the wall. The shed is dimmer now as the light outside fades, and the tools are all in their proper positions, the spade and the fork in their notches, and the watering bucket hanging dry, and the curved harvesting knife on its peg with the blade wiped clean of sap. You run your hand over the handle of the spade as you turn to leave, a small gesture of farewell that you make without thinking. Now you walk back through the Cloister arcade to the garth where the linen cloth still waits on the grass path with its cargo of bundled herbs. The bundles have rested in the shade through the late afternoon, and they are cool to the touch when you kneel beside them, the twine dry around their stems and the leaves beginning to relax from the crispness of the cutting. You gather the corners of the cloth together and lift the whole package, cradling it against your chest with both arms as you did before, and you carry it slowly out of the garth and through the low wooden door into the cloister walk. The cloister is quiet at this hour, the brothers having gone to their tasks or to their private prayer before the evening office, and your footsteps are the only sound as you walk along the arcade with the bundle of herbs in your arms. The flagstones under your leather soles are worn smooth, and they reflect the golden light that slants through the arches, each stone a pale rectangle that guides you forward. The scent of the bundled herbs rises from the cloth and surrounds you as you walk, a fragrance that is sweet and sharp and green all at once. The angelica and the mint and the sage and the hyssop mingling into a single aromatic cloud that moves with you down the corridor. You pass the chapter house and the scriptorium and the warming room, familiar doorways that you have passed thousands of times, and you turn at the corner where the northern arcade meets the eastern one, the place where the cistern sits under its open ceiling and where the air is always a little cooler and a little damper than elsewhere. Beyond the cistern, a narrow passage leads to all the inner rooms of the Abbey, and you take this passage now, the walls closing in on either side, so that the sound of your steps echoes briefly between the stone. The passage is darker than the cloister walk because it has no arches opening to the sky, only a single small window at the far end that admits a pale square of light, and you walk toward this light with the bundle held steady in your arms. The drying room is at the end of this passage, a modest chamber built against the outer wall of the Abbey kitchen, where the warmth from the great ovens seeps through the stone and keeps the air just above the temperature of the outside. The door is a heavy slab of oak with iron hinges, and you push it open with your shoulder and step inside. The room is dim and cool despite the warmth from the kitchen wall, and the air is dry and still and smells of all the herbs that have hung here in seasons past. A complex layered fragrance that is the ghost of many harvests. Across the ceiling run several sturdy beams from which iron hooks depend, and from these hooks hang the drying racks, which are simple wooden frames strung with cords in which the herb bundles can be tied. You set the linen cloth down on the wooden table that stands against one wall, a table that is scarred and stained by years of use, and you open the corners of the cloth to reveal the bundles lying in their orderly row. One by one you lift them out and carry them to the racks. The angelica bundles go on the highest hooks where the air is warmest, and the stems can dry slowly without mouldering. The mint bundles hang on the lower cords where the air moves more freely from the small vent near the door, because mint must dry quickly or it will blacken and lose its virtue. The sage and the hyssop fill the middle spaces, their bundles swinging slightly as you hang them, settling into their new positions with a gentle rustle. The small linen bag of chamomile flowers you place on a wooden tray that sits on a shelf near the vent, where the air will circulate around it and dry the petals without crushing them. When all the bundles are hung, you step back and look at them, the neat row of green sheaves suspended from the dark beams, their cut ends pale and their leaves beginning to relax into the shapes they will hold as they dry. The room is very quiet and the light from the single small window has faded to a deep grey, and you know that outside the sun is setting and the bell will soon ring for vespers. You fold the linen cloth and lay it over the table, and you close the door of the drying room behind you with a soft click of the latch, leaving the herbs to their slow transformation in the dark. The passage back to the cloister walk feels shorter than it did before, and when you step out into the arcade, the sky above the garth is a wash of pink and pale gold, and the first faint star is visible high in the east. The garden lies in the deepening twilight, the beds dark and the paths pale, and the cherry tree a dark shape against the coloured sky. You walk back to the low wooden door and pause with your hand on the iron latch, looking out at the garden one last time before you close it for the night. The herbs stand in their quiet rows, and the blackbird has gone to its roost, and the only sound is the distant murmur of the river and the soft creak of the weather vane turning on the chapter house roof. The garden is at peace, and so are you. The sound of the Angelus bell comes across the darkening fields from the Abbey tower, just as the last band of pink fades from the sky above the western arcade. 3 strokes followed by 3 more, and then 3 again. A slow, measured ringing that has marked this hour for centuries and will mark it for centuries more. You hear it as you stand at the edge of the garth with your hand on the iron latch of the low wooden door, and you pause there without moving, letting the bell complete its call while the twilight deepens around you, and the shadows merge into a single general darkness under the cloister arches. The bell strokes fall one after another with a long pause between each group, the bronze note hanging in the still air and then fading so slowly that the silence after the final stroke seems to continue the sound in a different form. When the Angelus is finished, you step back from the door and walk across the grass to the corner of the garth where the watering bucket still sits on the flagstones, the one you used for the final rinse after the bundling and forgot to return to the shed in the busyness of the tidying. The bucket is empty now, and its inside is damp and cool, the oak stave still holding the memory of the water they carried through the day. You pick it up by the rope handle and carry it to the cistern corner, but there is no need to draw more water now, because the garden has been watered and the herbs are settling into the night. Instead, you tip the bucket on its side over the stone lid of the cistern and let the last few drops fall into the opening, a thin trickle that you hear falling for a long moment before it meets the dark surface far below with a small distant plink that echoes up through the shaft. You take the bucket to the tool shed, which is now in full shadow, with only the faintest grey light coming through the small window, and you hang it upside down on its peg where it will dry through the night. The spade is still leaning against the wall where you left it after the turning of the comfrey bed, and you lift it and carry it to the cistern corner where a small channel of water runs along the base of the wall from a seep in the stone. You dip a handful of water from the channel and splash it over the blade of the spade, then take a scrap of dry sacking from the hook beside the cistern and wipe the iron clean of the soil that still clings to it in a thin film. The soil comes away easily, the iron brightening under the damp cloth, and you work the sacking into the curve where the blade meets the shoulder and then along the cutting edge until the metal is clean and dark and gleaming faintly in the last light. The ash handle you wipe with the dry end of the sacking, drawing the cloth along the grain from the socket to the top, and the wood takes on a soft glow where the polishing passes. You return the spade to its notch in the shed, settling the handle into the wooden cradle and the blade flat against the stone wall, and you do the same with the hand fork and the harvesting knife, each tool wiped and checked and placed in its appointed spot. The rake and the broom you have already hung, and the weeding board is leaning against the wall with the straw padding turned inward so that it will stay dry. You stand in the doorway of the shed and look at the tools arranged in their order, the dark shapes of wood and iron barely visible in the dimness, and you feel the same quiet satisfaction that you feel at the end of every day, the knowledge that everything is ready for the morning. The low wooden door is still ajar from when you passed through it earlier, a pale rectangle of deeper darkness in the shadow of the cloister wall, and you walk toward it along the empty arcade. The flagstones under your feet have cooled with the evening, and the air in the cloister walk has taken on the damp stone smell that comes whenever the sun leaves the walls. The pillars rise on your left in their steady procession, and the arches open on your right to the garth where the garden is now a pattern of darker and less dark shapes. The herbs reduced to mounds and clumps of blackness against the pale grey of the paths. The cherry tree stands at the centre of it all, a broad dark mass against the sky that is now the deep luminous blue of late twilight. You push the low wooden door open and step into the garth one final time, because there is a small ritual that you perform at the end of every day, and you would not feel the day was complete without it. You walk slowly along the grass path that circles the central square, your feet finding the way by feel as much as by sight, and you pass each bed in turn and look at it with the same attention you gave it in the morning. The comfrey has closed its leaves slightly around the central crown, a night posture that protects the growing point from the cool air. The fennel seedlings are invisible in the dark, but you know they are there, standing in their row with their roots reaching deeper into the soil. The angelica in its corner has folded its great leaves downward, and the lavender is a dark mound that releases a last whisper of fragrance as you brush past it. The chamomile flowers have closed for the night, the white petals folded over the yellow centres, and they will open again when the first warmth of the morning touches them. Each plant is doing what plants do in the dark, slowing its breathing, conserving its moisture, waiting for the sun. You complete the circuit and find yourself at the center of the garth beside the cherry tree, standing on the circle of bare earth where the grass does not grow because the tree's roots have claimed the ground. You look up through the branches at the sky where more stars have appeared, small cold points of light that seem to pulse very faintly in the stillness. The moon has not yet risen, but the stars are bright, and you can see the shape of the cherry leaves against them, each leaf a dark silhouette edged with the faintest silver. The blackbird is silent now, roosting somewhere in the thickest part of the tree, and the only sound is the distant murmur of the river and the even more distant bark of a fox from the water meadows, and the soft sigh of the breeze as it moves through the cloister arches. You turn away from the tree and walk to the low wooden door, your steps on the gravel path, the last sound you will make in the garden today. The door stands open, and the darkness of the cloister walk lies beyond it, and you pause with your hand on the iron latch that is cool and smooth under your fingers. You look back one more time at the garth, the square of grass and beds, and the dark shape of the cherry tree, and the paler shapes of the pillars and arches that enclose it all. And the sight is as familiar to you as your own hands, and yet it seems new every evening. A thing that has been made and tended and is now resting in the care of the night. The scent of damp soil and lavender rises from the beds, and the cool air carries the clean green smell of the herbs that you have cut and bundled and hung in the drawing room, a fragrance that has seeped out through the walls and drifted back to the garden where it began. You pull the low wooden door closed, and the sound it makes is a solid soft thump as the latch slips into its iron keep, a sound that is final without being loud, the closing of a chapter rather than the end of a book. You stand on the flagstones of the arcade with the door closed behind you and the garden sealed away for the night, and you feel the weight of the day settle into your bones, not as tiredness, but as a deep physical memory of the work that has been done. The cold of the morning, the turning of the soil, the drawing of the water, the careful placing of the seeds, the patient pulling of the weeds, the rest in the shade at noon, the cutting and the bundling, the raking of the paths, the hanging of the herbs in the drawing room, all of these things are now part of the day that is over, and they have left their mark on you in the pleasant ache of your back, and the roughness of your palms, and the quiet calm that fills your mind. You walk along the cloister arcade toward the passage that leads to the lay brothers' quarters, your footsteps soft on the cool flagstones, and the abbey around you has settled into the deep silence of the evening. The brothers are in the choir for Compline, the last office of the day, and their voices drift out through the open windows of the chapter house, a low murmur of plainsong that is more like a vibration in the air than a sound. The words are the same words that are sung every night, the prayers for protection and for peaceful rest and for the coming of the light in the morning, and you know them by heart without ever having learned them consciously. The singing stops, and the silence that follows is deep and complete, the kind of silence that seems to have a substance of its own. You reach your cell and push open the door that is never locked, and the small stone room is dark except for the thin line of starlight that comes through the narrow window slit. The blanket lies folded on the wooden bed, and the basin on the ledge still holds a little water from the morning, and everything is as you left it. You take off the cord from around your neck and hang the iron key on the peg beside the door, and you slip the brown tunic over your head and hang it on the other peg to air through the night. The air in the cell is cool and still, and carries the faint scent of the lavender that you keep in a small linen bag under your pillow, and you lie down on the straw mattress and pull the wool blanket over your body, feeling the coarse warmth settle around you. Your mind drifts back over the day as it always does, not in a sequence of thoughts but as a series of images that pass behind your closed eyes. The first grey light touching the chapter house roof, the dark soil turning under the spade, the water falling from your cupped hand onto the thirsty bed, the seeds rolling in your palm, the weeds piling on the stone path, the golden light of the afternoon slanting through the arches, the bundles of herbs hanging from their cords in the drawing room, the garden resting under the stars with the low word cloth. The images come without any order and without any urgency, and they fade one by one into the general darkness behind your eyelids. The abbey bell will ring again for matins in the deep of the night, and you will rise and dress and walk through the dark cloister to the garden, and the blackbird will be in the cherry tree, and the dew will be on the grass, and the first grey light will be touching the top of the chapter house roof, and the day will begin again, in the same slow rhythm, the same careful attention, the same quiet peace that has filled this enclosed garden and this enclosed life for all the years you have been here and for all the years that will come after. But for now there is only the dark and the silence and the soft breathing of sleep, and the garden outside the walls waiting in the starlight for the morning.